Hello, I'm Darren Magee and welcome to my mental health information and awareness channel. Now today's topic is going to be on fictional serial killer Paul Spector from the BBC series The Fall. Now, just to make you aware, this video is going to contain a lot of spoilers, so if you haven't seen the series, maybe you want to watch that first. Okay? Now, Spector is played by actor Jamie Dornan. So, little bit about Paul. First of all, Paul's father is convicted of murder and his mother commits suicide when he was a child. He ends up being raised in care. He moves from one place to the next, eventually ending up in a care home which is run by a priest named Father Jensen, who sexually abused the boys in his care. When being questioned about this, Paul does not deny the abuse, but rather he claimed he made himself repulsive by not washing, so the priest would leave him alone. As an adult, Paul's married to a pediatric nurse. He's a psychotherapist specialising in bereavement counselling. He has two young children. His daughter, in particular, he's very attentive and protective over. He analyses his own actions in a journal, showing both a mix of egotism and self loathing. And this analysis over his actions, over his murders, this gives him a sense of control over the killer profile that he finds himself in. As a therapist, we see a sense of a duty of care. For example, when he reports there's domestic violence taking place between a husband and a wife, he acts by informing the police and social services. But again, as the series goes on, you're left wondering how much of this is duty of care towards the victim, and how much of this is him wanting to have control to be more powerful than the other abuser. We see clinical insight, for example, whenever he's being interrogated by Detective Superintendent Stella Gibson, played by Gillian Anderson. When she's trying to analyze him, when she's trying to question him, she says things like, "Your mother must have meant a great deal to you," and he replies, "Everyone's mother means a great deal to them." He's undermining her attempted analysis. He can see through what she's trying to do. So as a serial killer, he's intelligent, he's educated, and he's insightful. He is in a position of responsibility and care to others. He is a caring father and husband. So whenever he claims he's volunteering to man a helpline, a voluntary helpline, who's going to suspect that he's actually stalking victims and committing murder? We see Paul selecting his victims. He researches them. The murders are meticulously planned. He does this to evade capture. And they're all professional women, all in their early 30s, pretty much the age his mother was when she died. He positions the bodies, he takes pictures of them in sexually provocative poses, so the allure, or part of the allure, of committing the murders is sexually motivated. He needs to have dominance as well as humiliation of others. So, what's going on with Paul Spector? Well, let's break down what seems to be happening, particularly when he's killing. Okay, so first of all, as cold, calm, collected as he seems to be when he's attacking, when he's murdering, I think it's fair to say there's a lot of inner turmoil, there's a lot of anxiety underlying those acts of aggression. This anxiety, of course, being a normal response to some kind of a threat, vague or specific, emotional or physical. And that's when different things start to kick into place, different kinds of defense mechanisms start to kick into place. So let's see them at work in Paul Spector. So first of all, you think of everything that's happened to him, as he tries to make sense of this, the abandonment, the abuse, there seems to be what I would think of as like a counterphobic attitude at work. Now, that is when someone actively seeks out the very things that terrify them or repulse them. If you will, it's a way of denying the distress that it brings. And in his case, the denial is trying to cope with, say, his mother's death. Like he said in one of his sessions with someone else, you don't have to accept it. He's trying to master it. He denies what happened. We later find out that he didn't actually make himself repulsive to the priest. He was, in fact, the priest's favourite, which meant he got more abuse than anyone else. We also learn later on that he is responsible for the death of a young woman years earlier when he was a student. And it's a death through what looks like misadventure, and it is a crime for which someone else is willingly serving the sentence for, thinking they owe Paul something. He also denies the impact these things have had on him, so he is actively pursuing the source of this distress, and he is pursuing the source of these distresses obsessively. Obsessively because he can't stop. And even when he rings Gibson to tease her, to tell her that he's done and that she's never going to catch him, she knows he will. She knows he's going to do it again. The rush he gets at that point of the victim's death builds up, that the expectation, the anticipation, that's addictive for him. And as I say, those murders, they're meticulously planned and carried out. He has a need to be in control, and we see this in other aspects of his life, in other little interactions as well. Spontaneous acts of violence would only bring up fear, which he experienced all those years ago, so he needs to be in control. Something else we see happen with Paul is there's like a splitting occurs. Now, splitting is when someone is unable to accept that, say, they have good and bad parts of themselves. And this causes an anxiety, a cognitive dissonance. That's when the psyche, if you will, splits into two. The good is what's acceptable, the bad is unacceptable. So we go from good Paul to bad Paul. Splitting is his way of coping with his mother's suicide, because he's good, he's a victim, he was helpless, but he's also bad because maybe he wasn't lovable, maybe he wasn't good enough for her. She chose to leave him, chose to abandon him. So on one hand, he pities her, he loves her, but he also harbors a lot of rage towards her for leaving him. It's like she's responsible for the abuse that followed in the years ahead. And even in the assaults themselves, there is further splitting, in that after killing them, he bathes them, he grooms them, he cleans them up, he puts nail polish on them. This is like Paul, good Paul, trying to undo what bad Paul has done. So, like, as much as he wants to punish his mother for leaving him, which he does through the murders and so on, he also wants to show her affection. The affection that maybe she showed him when he was younger. And he does this by nurturing the bodies. Which leads me on to undoing. Undoing is another kind of defense mechanism, and that's where someone tries to change, alter something that they have done in retrospect. It's, if you will, it's almost like trying to wave a magic wand to repair the damage, to repair the act. In simpler terms, it's not unlike having an argument with a loved one and making it up to them by bringing them flowers or chocolates, or giving them a hug. And this comes across also in his work as a bereavement counsellor, because on one hand, he is inflicting death, pain, grief on others, but on the other hand, he is helping people work through theirs. And this particularly comes across in the scene when he's working with a grieving couple who have lost a child. But what also comes across is it sounds more like it's his stuff he's working through rather than theirs. In one scene he says to them, you don't have to accept what happened. I don't subscribe to that model of grief. I don't see bereavement as ever being resolved or accepted. There is no closure, there is no recovery. And again, it sounds more like he's working through his own stuff. And the curious thing is, if memory serves, in that scene, while he's talking to them like this, he's actually sketching a picture of the mother naked. So he isn't even fully present in the room. It's his agenda, it's his stuff that he's working through. He's working through his own grief, his own anger, vicariously. Something else we also see at work here is like introjection. Now, that is when someone takes on another person's beliefs, another's beliefs. They take them on as if they're their own. He has internalized his mother's sense of hopelessness, rage, and hatred. He's turned that inwards into himself, into both contempt for himself, but also justification for himself. And again, one of the lines he comes up with when he's being interrogated by the police is, once a man has achieved contempt for himself, he achieves contempt for all man-made laws, all moralities, and he is free to do what he wills. But again, this is in conflict with, again, the good Paul and the bad Paul. The self-hatred, that's maintained by being vile, by being despicable. The more killing he does, the more that fuels the contempt. But the more contempt, the more he tries to undo. The more he tries to undo, the more contempt he feels. He's unable to reconcile the good and bad in him, and on it goes. But those times when we do try to see him separate the cold killer from the role of caring, loving father, what we see is like compartmentalizing. Now, in everyday terms, this is like when someone can separate their professional role at work with their home life. Okay, being able to separate the two, but this doesn't work so well for him. Particularly when he sees how disturbed his daughter is, through some of the dark pictures that she's been drawn and so on. It also doesn't come across so well when you see his emotional manipulation of an infatuated teenage girl. Because one thing that does come across with Paul is he has empathy for children. He even shows compassion and tenderness to the child of one of his victims. But again, this is conflicting with his own criminal behaviour because he is abusing victims. He, even by killing someone, he's inflicting abuse and distress on the children. Another kind of compartmentalizing which comes to mind is we learn later on that he changed his name. He changes his name to Spector. I'm wondering, is this a way of him trying to leave behind the past, to try and get a new identity, and in some attempt to reinvent himself? Like he's a new person, so all those things in the past, they didn't happen. Then we see the impulsiveness. Now, as much as I said about the murders and so on being planned meticulously, there is still an impulsiveness there. For example, when his wife finds out that he hasn't been at the helpline, and he could well be a suspect in some of the killings, he claims he was having an affair, but he claims he was having an affair with their 15-year-old babysitter. He's acting very much in that moment, but he paints himself as a paedophile. And in his mind, perhaps that's more acceptable than the serial killer. But he also recognises he can use that as leverage. He tells his wife, if that were to get out, her job as a paediatric nurse, that's over. So again, impulsiveness is there, but he turns that and he uses that into a sense of control. We see further impulsiveness later on when being questioned by Gibson, even in the presence of his lawyer. He'd been shot, so he's claiming he can't remember the killings. He can't remember his confession. He has amnesia. She doesn't believe this. She sees through this. She is convinced he's fainted. He's malingering, if you will. And she keeps saying things to get a response. And one of the things she says is she tells him she knows the truth. She knows he didn't make himself vile to the priest. She tells him that she knows he was the favourite, which meant he had a lot more abuse than any of the others. So he wasn't the hero. He was the helpless victim. He was a child. In that moment, we see the ego being bruised. We see that being poked with a stick, if you will. And he lashes out. He aggressively assaults her and others in the room. The mask comes off. We see that internalized rage coming out into the open. So in summary, Paul Spector, he's a very complicated character. And I think that's what makes him so compelling. He, psychopath, sociopath, whatever, there's a lot going on with him. There is both sympathy and revulsion for him at the same time. He is continually surprising. And I think, the thing is, as much as you can speculate about someone, as much as we can apply psychological theory and so on, in real life, human beings are incredibly complex, and he is probably a lot more so. But I think, there's no actual black or white. There's a lot of shades of grey. I suppose, ironically, perhaps 50 shades, maybe? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, please use the box below. I'd be keen to read your thoughts on Paul Spector. Please consider subscribing to my channel for future updates on mental health related topics. Until next time, thanks for watching.